Picture starting your workday not with coffee or opening a laptop, but with someone strapping a pack roughly the weight of a small child onto your shoulders and then covering a distance most people today only manage once on marathon day, if ever, every single day in any weather for years on end, with no option to call in sick or push the deadline back a day. That was ordinary life for a Roman legionary, and the strangest part of the story isn't the distance itself, it's how deliberately, almost obsessively engineered the whole system behind it turned out to be, down to the smallest detail of the shoes on its feet. Under ordinary conditions, a Roman legion's standard daily march covered about 20 Roman miles, roughly 29 kilometers in 5 hours, a pace worked out with the same precision as a modern train schedule according to the military writer Vegetius, who compiled a Roman training practice into a single treatise centuries later. When circumstances demanded it, the legion shifted into a faster pace and covered 24 miles instead, close to 36 kilometers in that same 5-hour window. Add in setting up and breaking camp morning and evening, scouting detachments and other movement around the main column, and the real daily distance regularly crept up toward the 40 kilometers you hear in popular accounts today. And that was with a soldier carrying anything but an empty bag. Legionaries hung their entire personal kit off a forked carrying pole known as the furca, slung across one shoulder. Food rations meant to last 2 weeks and sometimes longer, a metal cooking pot, a canteen, personal effects, a cloak, and tools that at first glance had nothing to do with fighting at all. A pickaxe, an entrenching spade, a saw, stakes for building a palisade, sometimes even a small basket for moving earth. Add in the soldier's own weapons, shield, and armor, and modern historians estimate the total load could run anywhere from about 20 to nearly 30 kilograms, with some ancient authors citing considerably higher figures for particular campaigns. This entire arrangement is precisely why the old baggage train sense of the Latin word impedimenta, literally things that get in the way, never quite applied to a legionary's own kit the same way. He wasn't being slowed down by his gear. He was carrying his own slow-down-proof supply line on his back. There was also a financial logic quietly reinforcing all of this. Roman soldiers didn't simply receive their equipment as a free gift from the state. Deductions for weapons, armor, clothing, and even food were routinely taken directly out of a legionary's pay, a system attested in surviving military pay records from the period. A soldier who genuinely owned, in a very real financial sense, the gear strapped to his own furca had an obvious personal stake in not losing it, damaging it, or leaving it behind on the march, in a way that gear issued casually from a shared baggage wagon never quite inspired. Carrying your own life's essentials, in other words, wasn't only about army logistics, it was also about making sure nobody treated their equipment as somebody else's problem. Which raises an obvious question. Why load a combat unit down with household equipment instead of handing it off to mules and wagons, the way virtually every other army in the ancient world did? The answer traces back to a specific military reform at the end of the 2nd century BC, usually credited to the general Gaius Marius, who was dealing with two problems at once. Rome's traditional army had always drawn its soldiers from property-owning citizens who could afford their own equipment, which meant a shrinking pool of eligible recruits as Rome's wars grew longer and more frequent. Marius opened recruiting to landless citizens as well, solving the manpower shortage, but that same class of recruit couldn't be expected to own an army's worth of pack animals and wagons on the side. So he solved both problems with a single stroke. Before the reform, the Roman army dragged along the same enormous, slow-moving baggage train every other ancient army did. Hundreds of wagons, thousands of pack animals, constantly stretching the column out, getting bogged down in mud, and presenting the single juiciest target for any enemy raiding party. Marius cut that baggage train down to the bare minimum and shifted the bulk of the load directly onto the soldiers' own shoulders instead. Almost overnight, the legion became dramatically more mobile, far less dependent on weather and road conditions, and considerably harder to cripple. Burning or looting a train of 20 wagons is a lot easier than forcing thousands of armed men to abandon their own gear in the middle of a field. That's exactly where legionaries picked up their mocking, oddly affectionate nickname, the Mules of Marius. The logic was simple enough. If a soldier was now hauling roughly what a pack animal used to carry, then in a sense he'd become one himself, just armed with a sword and capable of building his own fortress by nightfall. Which brings us to the second reason the whole system actually made sense: the camp. Every single time a legion stopped for the night, even on territory that seemed perfectly safe, the soldiers threw up a fully fortified marching camp within a matter of hours, complete with a ditch, an earthen rampart, and a palisade built from those exact stakes each man had been carrying on his own pole all day. That meant the Roman army essentially never spent a night undefended, no matter how unexpectedly it had to halt. An enemy hoping to catch a legion off guard at night instead found a small fortress built in a few hours by the same men who had just marched 30 kilometers that day. What's especially striking is that the camp's internal layout stayed almost identical every single time. The same main road running through the center, known as the Via Principalis, the commander's tent, the Praetorium, always positioned in the same relative spot, the same gates in the same compass positions, regardless of which corner of the empire the legion happened to be in. A soldier coming back from night patrol could find his own tent in total darkness purely out of habit, even in a place he'd never set foot in before, simply because the map in his head never actually changed from one camp to the next. Speed itself was another deliberate strategic weapon. The ability to move faster than an enemy expected repeatedly turned out to be the deciding factor in Roman campaigns, and the clearest example is Julius Caesar, famous for lightning-fast marches during his Gallic campaigns, at times covering distances in days that opposing tribes assumed would take him weeks, letting him show up somewhere his opponents hadn't even considered yet and win engagements before a single sword was drawn. The endurance needed for all of this was never left to individual luck or natural toughness. According to Vegetius, recruits were required to march 20 miles in 5 summer hours, carrying weapons and gear weighing no less than 60 Roman pounds, deliberately heavier than much of what they'd actually haul on campaign. And this training march was repeated 3 times a month rather than treated as a one-off. On top of that came regular running in full kit, jumping drills, and swimming practice in armor, conditioning routines that any modern strength and conditioning coach would immediately recognize, all specifically designed so the real campaign would feel lighter than basic training by comparison, rather than the other way around. Even something as small as military footwear turned out to matter enormously. Standard-issue army sandals, the colleghi, had a thick, multi-layered sole studded with iron hobnails, which improved grip on the road and also dramatically extended the sandal's usable life over long marches, a detail so carefully engineered that archaeologists still find these hobnails in the ground along old Roman roads today, occasionally arranged in the exact pattern they once held on a sandal that rotted away centuries ago. Written evidence backs this up too. Among the famous wooden writing tablets excavated at the fort of Vindolanda in northern Britain, one surviving letter is a soldier's family sending him socks and sandals to cope with the cold and the wear of constant marching, a small domestic detail that quietly confirms just how much day-to-day attention got paid to keeping a legionary's feet in working order. None of this happened by accident or tradition alone, either. Roman commanders treated the daily march itself as a form of discipline, not just transportation, a way of keeping an army occupied, orderly, and too physically tired for the kind of idle grumbling that tends to precede mutiny. A legion that arrived at its destination exhausted but organized was, from a commander's point of view, a far safer force to manage than one that had spent the day riding comfortably and had energy left over for complaints. And then, of course, there were the roads themselves. Rome's famous dead-straight, meticulously engineered highways weren't built for scenic value. Roman engineers laid them in distinct layers, starting with a foundation of large fitted stones, then a course of compacted rubble, then a fine binding layer, topped finally with closely fitted paving stones sloped just enough to drain rainwater off to the sides. All of it specifically so an army could maintain that same predictable pace day in and day out, rain or shine, on a surface that would have stopped virtually any other ancient army's wagons and pack animals dead in spring mud. Put it all together and you get a system where every individual piece reinforces the next one. A heavy pack replaced the vulnerable baggage train, and in the process turned an army of landless recruits into a genuinely mobile fighting force. A fortified camp every night guaranteed safety without depending on the local terrain or the goodwill of whatever region the Legion happened to be marching through. Training in advance made the real march feel manageable rather than punishing, and a soldier too exhausted to complain was, in practice, a soldier a commander didn't have to worry about. Good roads and good footwear turned an exhausting distance into a routine, almost boring part of the job. Which means those same 40 kilometers a day, a distance that sounds like an endurance feat to us now, were most likely for the legionary himself just an ordinary Tuesday. Except one that still ended with digging a ditch and putting up a palisade before anyone got any sleep, and started again the next morning at exactly the same pace as the one before it.